a hidden land whose previous discovery was long lost to time, a continent as rich in culture as in materials, the starter pistol for a colonial race that would change the world forever. The landing of a Spanish expedition at what is now the Bahamas is undeniably a turning point in history, but behind the parades and the textbook tributes, who was Christopher Columbus, and what does his legacy mean for us? Christopher Columbus, the son of a Genoese weaver, was born in 1451. He sailed many of the trade routes through the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Though these ventures were profitable, hostility with the Islamic world was an ever-constant threat. Columbus conceived an alternative to these risky waters. He believed that sailing westward through the Atlantic would bring him to the rich ports of the Orient, faster and safer than the existing routes. After being rejected by a number of European sovereigns, his plan was eventually accepted by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, reigning monarchs of Spain. His idea was disputed by his contemporaries, who claimed he had miscalculated the Earth's circumference. While his estimation is known to be incorrect, that wasn't the main obstacle to his proposed route. That distinction goes to a pair of continents lying in his path. On October of 1492, Columbus's expedition had unknowingly encountered the Americas. For many people, this is where the story ends. America is born and liberty prevails. The rest is just history. But should it be? Christopher Columbus was not the first to arrive on the shores of the so-called New World. Not just predated by Norsemen almost half a millennium earlier, Christopher Columbus had discovered a land that was already inhabited. Native American civilizations abounded on the continent, unaffected by Old World developments. Leaving aside the long-term ethics of colonialism, what consequences did Spanish contact have for the Taino of San Salvador? Did Christopher Columbus spread humanity, spoil paradise, or something in between? The Taino were one of a number of indigenous groups living in the Caribbean. What Columbus named San Salvador, the first island he sighted and landed on, the Taino called Guanahani. Though they did not possess the technology of Europe, the people Columbus encountered were far from savages. They lived in large, immobile settlements, ruled by chiefs, and possessed a rudimentary class system, though they did not have a landed slave class. They had a spirituality centered on zemis, or spirits, which they believed to take residence in totems and fetishes. When Columbus pulled onto the shores of Guanahani, he determined the natives to be an inoffensive people. Not recognizing their practices as religion, he deemed them to be promising candidates for Christianization, and wrote that they would make good servants. The men on Columbus's expedition traded their goods, including broken glass and beads, for rolls of yarn, parrots, and javelins. The inhabitants of some villages proclaimed Columbus and his men to have come from the heavens. Despite their friendly nature, the Taino were accustomed to conflict, and some of them whom Columbus first met had war wounds. Columbus thought them to be simple in warlike matters, and, in his journal, wrote, "I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men, and govern them as I pleased." 6 of the Taino were brought back to Spain from Columbus's first voyage, and, though most were returned to the Caribbean, one remained at the Spanish court under the stewardship of the monarchy and died 2 years later. In addition to human specimens, another nefarious exchange took place, that of disease. European afflictions like smallpox and measles were, over time, transferred to the native population, and syphilis returned to Europe with Columbus. What effect did all of this have on Europe? Though Columbus did not find a new trading route to Asian ports, he did find a land brimming with undiscovered animals and plants, alongside novelties like aloe, were potatoes and corn, which, due to their high agricultural output, quickly became staples in Europe. A major economic shift, known as the Price Revolution, took place in Europe beginning in the late 15th century. Inflation caused the value of currency and the real value of debts to decrease dramatically. This event was furthered by the influx of gold and silver from the New World. The massive demand from trade goods strengthened the European merchant class. Conversely, traditional powers like landowners were weakened, as the fixed rent payments many landowners relied on became worth far less due to inflation. Manufacturing demand for all of these new trade goods fell largely on the shoulders of England and France, cementing their role as economic powers of Europe for centuries to come. A more human effect of America's discovery was the introduction of tobacco. Tobacco became an important cash crop, produced all over the world, and most notably in the American colonies, where it heavily influenced the expansion of slavery. Though the stimulant was not brought to the Old World until the mid-16th century, Columbus was the first to encounter it, when dried tobacco leaves were offered to him and his crew by natives. In the New World, the aftermath of first contact was similarly disruptive and much more controversial, though they benefited somewhat from material exchange, with horses and wheat becoming integral to the lives of many native groups. The effects were largely negative. Disease ravaged the Taino population of Hispaniola, with a majority dying in a smallpox outbreak in 1520. This epidemic was exacerbated by conditions forced upon the Taino by Europeans, who herded them into smaller, denser settlements, and the encomienda feudal system, through which natives were exploited for labor. This system resulted in malnutrition and mass death. The smallpox spread through trade to the Taino of Puerto Rico and the rest of the Caribbean. Though involuntary contagion was partially to blame for the fall of the Taino, a report published in 1542 reveals to what degree Spanish rulership had a cruel hand in the native demise. A short account on the destruction of the Indies was written by Bartolomé de la Casa, a Dominican priest who devoted his life to protecting the natives of the Caribbean and abolishing slavery. De la Casa's account describes atrocities committed against the indigenous lands. In Hispaniola, the first region encountered by Europeans, the natives quickly realized the nature of the colonists. The image of the Europeans as visitors from the heavens was shattered by their rapacious appetites for native women and children, and for crops, which they extorted through force. When a local leader's wife was raped by a European commander, the indigenous population began to fight back. Their resistance was quickly put down by the Spanish with their superior weaponry. As retaliation, the Spanish slaughtered the natives en masse. Some of the natives were burned alive by executioners, and others were mutilated and sent off as a warning to the others. Europeans made sportsmanly bets on what they could do to the natives with their weapons, like slicing them in half or decapitating them. De la Casas alleges that Europeans threw newborns into rivers, joking all the while. This was partially the result of a perception that the natives constituted natural slaves, lacking basic humanity and courage, barely more than livestock. The natives who greeted Columbus at his fateful landing suffered greatly for the incident. But how did Columbus himself treat the inhabitants of the New World? As the governor of the first settlement, Villa de Navidad, he instituted a policy of forced labor over the natives. His aim was to find large sums of gold which would please the Spanish crown and produce a handsome profit. He failed in this regard, finding very little gold and angering the natives with his brutal and inhumane treatments. He shipped 500 native slaves back to Spain, almost half of whom died during the journey. The Spanish queen was horrified by this and demanded that slavery cease, but Columbus defied her. He established his brothers as governors of the settlement in his absence. But their mismanagement enraged the settlers and led to Columbus's arrest at the hands of the Spanish royal authority. Columbus seemed to have a kind of admiration towards the natives, as he referred to them as handsome and thought they would make capable servants. But his lust for gold and his desire to please the Spanish crown turned the Genoese explorer into a failed slaver, hated by his superiors and his subjects, and eventually stripped of all his titles. For a man given a great deal of credit and greatly admired, Columbus's story ends in failure and the seeds of suffering being sown in countless directions. The discovery of tobacco would cause the innumerable deaths of both those who would use the drug for centuries to come and the transatlantic slave trade it stimulated. The Taino people, members of whom first greeted him on the shores of Guanahani, would be destroyed by disease and murder. The colonial ambitions his discovery sparked would devastate the American continents and leave a legacy of conquest and abuse alongside proud nations like Canada and the United States. The discovery of the Americas had positive and negative effects on mankind's history. But is it fair to attribute that all to Christopher Columbus? When we think back on history's greats, should Columbus be among them? Do the benefits of colonization and trade outweigh the crimes of slavery and genocide? Did he create new potential for the Americas, or destroy that of the native peoples whose freedom was lost? Is he a symbol of flawed greatness, crossing oceans in pursuit of the impossible, or of greed and corruption, a hard-hearted sycophant who put shackles on the innocent? Parsing through our heritage, we see the many facets of this man, but it is up to each of us to decide how history should remember Christopher Columbus.